Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Sound Effects. Special effects of the sounds we make to launch the new year on the highest of notes. Today we're going to begin a series that will delve into the mystical secrets emitted by the shofar. The focus will be, in broad sense, on appreciating and understanding the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Chasidic movement's special mystical meditations for the sounding of the shofar and the launching of a new year. We'll be focused on the Sha'ar HaTekiyot, which is a portion of the Siddur that was printed in the early 19th century by the second Rebbe of the Chabad-Lubavitch dynasty, called the Mittler Rebbe. Most of the Mimer and most of the Hasidic discourses here are actually teachings of the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the movement, known as the Baal HaTanya v'HaShulchan Aruch. The majority of these Mimerim were actually committed to writing in their present form as we have them by the Mittler Rebbe, his eldest son and successor. The Siddur was arranged in its present iteration by our Rebbe, and recently very, very well and beautifully redone and represented. The second Mimer in the Sha'ar HaTekiyot, which is the gate of shofar blasts, opens with the words, Lahavin Inyan Tekiyas Shofar, to understand the concept of the shofar sounds. And in parentheses, Al pi Kavanah Baal Shem Tov Zichrono Livracha, by virtue of or dint of the intentions, the mystical intentions of the Baal Shem Tov of blessed memory. And before we go any further, I would like to dedicate today's class to trying to develop an understanding of what does that mean, Kavanah Baal Shem Tov. What do mystical intentions or Kavanah HaKabbalah mean altogether? And is this relevant for us? Is it important that we study it? I want to begin by telling you that the Kavanah Baal Shem Tov are something that's very special. Here's a story that's recorded in Shmos V'Sipurim, authored by the father of Rav Yoel Kahn, Reb Folle Kahn. So the story is that the Maggid of Mizrich, the successor of the Baal Shem Tov, asks his youngest disciple, whom we call the Alter Rebbe, if he will be the one to sound the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. The Alter Rebbe immediately agrees on a condition, that his mentor, the Maggid, will share with him the secrets of the Kavanot Baal Shem Tov. Will share with him the mystical intentions formulated by the holy Baal Shem Tov himself. The Maggid agreed. He shares these mystical secrets with the Alter Rebbe. And when he finishes, the Alter Rebbe expresses his gratitude. And he tells the Maggid, I can't blow the shofar. And the Maggid says, why not? And the Alter Rebbe says, because I'm not a shofar blower. I just can't do it. I don't blow shofar. So the Maggid said, then why did you tell me to teach you the Kavanah of Baal Shem Tov? Loma rimisani. Why did you, so to speak, pull the wool over my eyes? The Baal Shem Tov clearly had these mystical secrets that he didn't share with many people. And here the Alter Rebbe had ferreted out these secrets from his teacher under the pretense that he would blow the shofar, when in fact he could not sound the shofar. The Alter Rebbe said, I learned from Moshe Rabbeinu. And he explained, Moshe Rabbeinu was told by God that he should go to Mitzrayim and take the Jewish people out of Egypt. So this is the burning bush event. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Moshe Rabbeinu is following a single solitary sheep, and he finally finds him, and there's this thorn bush. It's on fire, but it's not being consumed. And Moshe Rabbeinu is told to remove his shoes, and he comes close, and God begins to communicate with Moshe Rabbeinu. It's Moshe Rabbeinu's maiden prophecy or revelatory experience. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, so when they'll ask me, what is your name? What will I say to them? I need to know your name. This is a subject that is beyond the purview of today's class. What's really going on? There's an amazing explanation from the Rebbe, a lengthy thesis from the Rebbe about this. But let me just say that it represents a very deep level of divinity, and Moshe Rabbeinu wants to learn and know about this level of divinity, just like a name or the expression that we use to get somebody's attention will typically address an element of their persona. Sometimes people call your name, and the way they pronounce your name indicates the kind of relationship they have with you. The name is like a handle. It's a mechanism through which we can get somebody's attention, through which we can address somebody. So Moshe Rabbeinu wants to know more about God, and he says, what's your name? They're going to ask me your name. And God says, Eker asher Eker, I will be as I will be. Again, the deeper meaning of that beyond the purview of our present subject. But afterwards, Moshe Rabbeinu says, Shlach no bi'at tishlach. Yeah, I can't do this. Send somebody else. So the question is, if Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want to go and he wasn't planning to serve as God's agent, why did he ask for God's name? So the Alter Rebbe says, because he wanted to know more about God. He wanted to have this awareness. And so the Alter Rebbe defended his position. He wanted to know more about Hashem. He wanted to learn mystical secrets. What are those Kavanot of Baal Shem Tov? We don't really know. There's a story that's told about a Talmud, a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, whose name was Reb Zev or Reb Wolf Kitzis. And the story is told that the Baal Shem Tov once instructed his disciple, Reb Wolf, that he should prepare himself to blow the shofar. And that he would serve as the one to sound the shofar in the Baal Shem Tov's minyan. And the Baal Shem Tov gave him the mystical secrets, the Kavanot, the meditations that he had formulated himself. Reb Zev, as per the Baal Shem Tov's instructions, learned these Kavanot, and he wrote a series of flashcards for himself so he could remember what to think about when. And he planned to glance at these flashcards to kind of trigger his memory and the things he learned and understood so that he could properly contemplate and reflect and think during the sounding of the shofar the ideas, the Torah ideas that the Baal Shem Tov had shared. The story is told that the Baal Shem Tov, in his holy ways, caused these papers to be lost. And Reb Zev was unaware. And when he approached the bima to lead the sounding of the shofar, he began to look for his flashcards, his papers, and he couldn't find them. Reb Zev couldn't remember the Kavanah of Baal Shem Tov without his notes. And he felt terrible. He felt like a dismal, utter failure. He heard that Baal Shem Tov, his Rebbe, had given him a job, a mission, and he failed. He didn't have the Kavanahs. And with tremendous heartbreak and a great deal of inner anguish, as the story goes, with a broken heart, Reb Zev sounded the shofar without any Kavanahs. When he finished, the Baal Shem Tov later said, in the palace of the king there are many chambers, many foyers, many halls. Each special room, each special sanctum, if you will, has its own lock its own key or keypad, codes through which you can enter that proverbial area, that metaphorical part of the king's palace. And then the Baal Shem Tov said there is a master key. There is a code that can open any lock. It's called a sledgehammer. If you smash the locks, you can always have them open and make your way in. The Kavanot, the mystical intentions, said the Baal Shem Tov, those are the secret codes. And every door has its own code. Every door has its own keypad. However, the master key, or the way that all locks can be opened, is when one's heart is utterly shattered and broken. And so the Baal Shem Tov said to the Wolf, when you have a truly shattered heart, that opens all of the locks. And you can enter all of the Hechalot, all of these heavenly sanctums. This teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, which is recorded in Chasidic lore, mirrors a teaching which I was able to find in a collection of Polish Hasidic teachings called Likutei Orot. Likutei Orot was put together by a man named Rabbi Yaakov Margolius, and he collected many, many teachings from the different Hasidic masters, and one of the teachings is about the codes or the intentions of the shofar blowing. And this is essentially how the teaching goes. I don't own the book, but I did get it printed out with the Yitzhak Chochmah. So it says that there are Kama Kavanot Arizal Umea Baal Shem Tov. There are multiple mystical meditations from the Arizal and from the Baal Shem Tov. And with Hashem's help, I am going to talk about the distinction between intentions of the Arizal and of the Baal Shem Tov, at least possibly trying to understand the distinction. However, the primary essence taught Rav Pesach of Zibriz is the broken heart, brokenheartedness, the shattering of one's ego, of one's self-importance, which brings about a cleaving to Hashem. And here in the Likutei Orot, it maintains that there is a teaching in manuscript from the Maggid of Mezrich, although we do not have that teaching in manuscript, printed in the name of the Maggid, that the Maggid said that the metaphor is that when you have many locks, there are different codes or different keys that can open those locks. And then there are thieves who break the locks. And they can enter anywhere, even though they don't have the keys or the code. And they do so simply by breaking the lock. So too, taught the Maggid, there are mystical intentions which can open specific doors. However, the most important thing of all is to break the locks. And the breaking of the locks is not achieved through the specific mystical intentions or kavanot, but rather through the breaking of one's heart and the absolute, total humbling of oneself before Hashem. And that is able to remove the proverbial screen or iron curtain that seems to stand between us and our Creator. And the Maggid is purported to have said that even though in my youth I learnt the specific codes, and I learnt and became aware of how to open those proverbial doors, now, in my mature age, I do not ruminate on the codes, but rather try primarily to focus on the breaking or shattering of one's ego and heart. And the Maggid went on to say that for most people, the specifics of Kavanah or Arizal are not helpful and are ineffective. That in order for a person to be successful at utilizing these codes, one has to experience a total divestiture from self-interest, sensual desire, cravings, lusts, self-importance, which includes, he said, also the desire to be honored and respected. And even people who don't immerse themselves in the fulfillment of self-gratification in a crass or animalistic way, but are still very much aware of their own prominence, self-importance, don't like being mistreated or abused. Have a sense of self-awareness, which leads also to things like jealousy, anger, even animosity towards another, to kina, sina, kas, v'chemda, nikima, netira, a desire to avenge a perceived offense, as is with regard to most people. So when you come with the codes, if you're in that realm, you're stuck within that reality, it's all counterfeit, and the codes don't work. But he said, brokenheartedness, in a sincere way, can always work. You don't have to be at a high or lofty level to be able to achieve this. And I don't know if the Likutei Eres is quoting the Maggid of Mizritch here or the Pesach, but he goes on to say that we find ourselves very, very distant from the proverbial revealed presence of Hashem. We're not able to focus entirely onto Hashem. We keep thinking about ourselves. So if we can't stop thinking about ourselves for a moment, we always obsess about ourselves and we're so concerned with ourselves, how can we focus on Kavanas ha'imdim berumi shalelam? How can we focus on mystical meditations, reflections, and intentions which speak about the loftiest of realities? And therefore, and again, I don't know if this is a quote from of Pesach or the Maggid, Bacharti li lechaven Kavanah achas. I chose to focus on one single intention, and that is to work as hard as I can to think about the literal meaning of the words and what I'm about to do, and to focus on a sense of self-abnegation, humbling, and this idea of shattering one's heart. So when we start to learn this Mimer, and we hear about Al-Pi Kavanah Baal Shem Tov, what is the intention? Are we talking about the codes? Or are we talking about the humbling of one's heart? Is this the Kavanah that the Baal Shem Tov taught the Maggid, that the Maggid told the Alter Rebbe? Is this what the Baal Shem Tov told Reb Zev or Revolv Kitzis? Or does this focus on something else? So before we talk about Kavanahs and how they're relevant and important, I want to share a couple of things with you. In the Sefer HaMenhagim Chabad, on page 56, it says, and I quote, the Rebbe writes, K'vei Kedushas Meir V'chami Admor, speaking of his father-in-law, the Rebbe, he wrote, Haya mitzava litkoya lahatekea lilmeid b'yemei Rosh Hashanah ba'boiker. He would instruct the person blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah in the morning, the Mimer, lahoven Inyan ki shofar, which is in the Siddur. And then the Rebbe writes, Hatam yesh leimer bepshitus The simple reason that can be attributed for the focus of learning this Mimer on Rosh Hashanah in the morning, because in this Chasidic rumination, the mystical intentions of the HaTekiyot are spoken about. Now, the thing is that we don't actually get in this Mimer what we tend to identify with mystical Kavanot, which I'm going to come back to. So much so that on Rosh Hashanah, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, in the year 1960, an elder Chassid at the Yom Tov table, at the Rebbe's Yom Tov table, named Reb Shmuel Levittin, says to the Rebbe, in the Siddur, in the Alter Rebbe's Siddur with Chasidus, there is Kavanah HaTekiyot meha Baal Shem Tov. However, said Reb Shmuel, when you learn through the Mimer, there's no actual teaching of the Baal Shem Tov mentioned. The Rebbe cryptically responded, Mistama yesh devarim b'goy. There's something there. Heim kshurim la Baal Shem Tov. It's zugebunden, the Rebbe said. Mistama is epis da. There's something there. He didn't talk about what, but he indicated that when you learn this Mimer, you are absorbing kavanas of the Baal Shem Tov. 2 years later, Rosh Hashanah, 1962, the Rebbe turns to the Rosh HaYeshiva of Yeshiva Torah V'das, who was a Lubavitch Chassid. His name was Moshe Dov Rifkin. And the Rebbe says to him, you merited to be the one to blow the shofar in the presence of the previous Rebbe. In the previous Rebbe's later years, he was unable to blow the shofar. And so, in his wheelchair, he would be at the bima and he would point to the actual words, Tekiah, Shvarim, Trua, and so on and so forth. But he wouldn't sound the shofar himself. And the Frierdiker Rebbe surely instructed you to learn this Mimer, Lahavan Inyan Tekiah Shofar. So the Rebbe asks Moshe Dov, did you by any chance ask my father-in-law, ask the Rebbe, the meaning of Kavanah Baal Shem Tov? What is meant by the intentions of the Baal Shem Tov? Where precisely in this Mimer Kavanah Baal Shem Tov show up? So there's Kavanah HaMikveh, the mystical intentions of the mikveh attributed to the Arizal, and then there is a mystical intention of the mikveh, immersion in the mikveh, attributed to the Baal Shem Tov. It's actually printed in the Siddur. But a specific intention or mystical meditations for the shofar blowing is not found, not even in any manuscripts. So Reb Shmuel Levittin, who, you remember, 2 years earlier, had asked the Rebbe about this, he says, what difference does it make? This is only relevant for the person who's sounding the shofar. We had the privilege that the Rebbe himself sounded the shofar. Reb Shmuel says, what difference does it make? The Rebbe knows, as if to say, why even have this conversation? And the Rebbe said something very interesting, my friends. And it's important that I share this with you because when you hear this, you will realize that whether or not you are sounding the shofar, if you're planning to be part of Tekiyat Shofar, to fulfill the mitzvah that's incumbent upon us all on the morning of Rosh Hashanah, then this series is important for you. The Rebbe said, as is recorded in the printed work HaMelech b'Mesibay, this is found on page 68, the Rebbe said, the person who sounds the shofar, the Baal Tokeah, is able to assist everyone who listens to discharge their halachic obligation insofar as shmiat kol shofar. There's an obligation incumbent upon every one of us on the day of Rosh Hashanah to hear the sounding of the shofar in a particular fashion. It's a mitzvah saseh, it's a positive mitzvah in the Torah. So there's a mitzvah to hear the sound of the shofar, not to sound or blow the shofar. And that's evident from the bracha, the blessing that's recited. It's not litkoa, to blow or sound the shofar, but lishmoa kol shofar, to hear the voice of the shofar. So the Rebbe tells Reb Shmuel, the person who is sounding the shofar is able to help you fulfill your mitzvah of listening to or hearing the shofar. Ach lechaven, but to have the intentions, the appropriate thoughts, reflections, and meditations, kol echad v'echad ba'atzmai, that's an individual responsibility. In other words, if there's something that we're supposed to be thinking of or focused on during the sounding of the shofar, we cannot achieve that by virtue of the kavanot, the mystical thoughts or intentions of the one sounding the shofar. That's a personal obligation. That's something we need to do individually. And the Rebbe offered a fascinating example of this from a different part of Torah. A biur, an explanation on a halachic level, in the exoteric part of Torah, from the Gaon of Rogatchov, the greatest Torah prodigy of the 20th century. The Rogatchover Gaon explains why it is that when we listen to the reading of the Megillah, and the mitzvah is to read the Megillah, it's al mikra Megillah, but the person who is reading the Megillah for us is in essence performing the mitzvah on our behalf, as long as we can hear him say the words, not on Zoom or on a microphone. You have to hear the actual voice of the Baal Korah, of the person reading the Megillah. And yet, when it comes to the reading of the 10 sons of Haman that are written in a unique fashion in the Megillah, the Baal Korah stops, and everybody present, whether they're looking in a kosher Megillah or not, reads the 10 sons of Haman as one is supposed to in a single breath. This commemorates the miracle that all of these 10 monstrous human beings, mass murderers, were killed at the same moment. Hung at the same exact moment. And that's part of the Purim miracle. So to commemorate the miracle of all of them being hung at once, of all this collection of monstrous humanity, of evil, pure evil, that we read the names of Haman in a single breath. And this is not the place for it, but there is a clear allusion within the sons of Haman to the Nazis and the Holocaust. So clearly this is a recurring theme. And that's beyond the purview of what we're talking about. So the question then is, why do we all have to read that on our own? Since we aren't all reading the Megillah ourselves, we're listening to the voice, and I can't emphasize that strongly enough, not to electronic impulses. We're listening to the voice of the person who's reading the Megillah. So if we hear him reciting, chanting the names of Haman's sons, why do we have to do it on our own? And the Rogatchover Gaon said that there is two elements. There is the words of the Megillah being read from a kosher Megillah. With this, you can fulfill your obligation by hearing the Baal Korah, the Megillah reader. But then there is this idea of how you read it. Namely, in this example, in a single breath, drawing a single breath. So you take a deep breath, v'yeis pashandasa, and you read all the names of Haman's sons. That nobody can do for you. Nobody can fulfill a breathing exercise for you. They can fulfill the sound. Audibility can be achieved by virtue of hearing somebody else audibly verbalizing the Megillah, because that's an audible issue. Words, spoken words, which actually will come into play in the learning of this Mimer a little later on. Spoken words, the audibility of the spoken word can achieve or satisfy the halachic obligation even if I am not the one who's mouthing those words or audibly expressing the names of Haman's sons. But the way in which it's made audible, the way in which it's expressed, in one breath, nobody can do that for you. And the Rebbe draws a line between that halachic observance and the idea of the proper thoughts and meditations for the sounding of the shofar. Simply stated, learning about these secrets is a duty for every one of us. Whether we are going to sound the shofar ourselves or listen to somebody else do it in expert fashion. No mitzvah for everybody to blow or sound the shofar. You can rely on whoever it is that studied the halachot and can effectively do the job. But the thoughts, the intentions, the consciousness or intellectual, cerebral, and emotional reflections are something we need to do on our own. Now, the Rebbe pointed out on Rosh Hashanah of 1963 that the Frierdiker Rebbe instructed the Baal Tokeya to read or study this Mimer on the morning of Rosh Hashanah, and not to rely on the study of the Mimer in days prior. But as somebody who's had the privilege to sound the shofar for 2.5 decades, and who has labored to try and study this Mimer on the morning of Rosh Hashanah, I can shamefacedly confess and tell you that I learned the hard way that the only way, at least for somebody like me, to be able to learn this Mimer in a way that's somewhat meaningful on the morning of Rosh Hashanah is by studying it for weeks in advance. I even make little highlights, write myself short notes, because otherwise it's a very onerous proposition. This is a difficult Mimer. This is all a preface to the preface, to the introduction. I hope that you're still watching. I hope you'll stay with me, because I really and truly believe that the time we will spend together over the next couple of weeks can make a world of difference for your fulfillment, whoever you are, of the mitzvah of shofar this year, and hopefully by focusing properly on the mitzvah of HaTekiyot shofar, which nobody can do for you, which everybody needs to work on by themselves. Hopefully we will become conduits for a wonderful new year of blessings and goodness that is sweet enough for us to taste in terrestrial and literal fashion. Before we go further and talk about Kavanahs of Baal Shem Tov, I want to talk about mystical intentions or Kavanot in general. Kavanah, mindfulness, or intentfulness, is considered to be an important part of our Yiddishkeit, of our subservience to Hashem. That is to say, Torah study is a cerebral activity. if you don't understand what you're learning, are you learning? If you're reading pages of Talmud or Mishnah or Medrash and don't understand a word or hardly can understand a word of what you're mouthing, did you study? You mouth words. Talmud necessarily means to grasp. Now, it is eminently true that we all understand things in a different way. Any 10 people can read the same manuscript or can listen to the same teacher and come away with the idea apprehended in slightly different fashion. It's because we all have a unique way of learning. We all have a unique way of understanding things. We frame things by our own experiences, by prior understandings. When you say the word heat or blistering heat, so people think of the hottest they've ever been. When you say the word pain, anguish, heartache, people will refer back to their own common experiences. When you say a word like happiness, inspiration, when you use a word like love, it can mean something different to just about anybody. We all process these things differently. There's an IQ and EQ dimension. We relate to things a certain way, we grasp, our minds work a certain way. So nobody understands things quite the same, although broadly speaking we can all more or less understand something in similar fashion. Prayer is about emoting to Hashem. Prayer is not just called toil. There's Amal Torah. Torah takes tremendous toil to study Torah properly, but that's to toil with your mind. Prayer is called avodah, subservience, servitude. Toil, shebelev. It's about developing an emotional relationship with Hashem. As the Chasidic adage or aphorism, which is found in Hayom Yom, says, when a person studies Torah, he's like a pupil before their master. But when a person prays, he's like a child before their parent. It's a different kind of relationship. One is framed by comprehension, understanding, intellectual apprehension, and one is framed by love, personal relationship. So the teacher appreciates pupils or students that can actually understand what the teacher's saying. The teacher's deepest relationship are with the brightest and the best students. Or perhaps the students who try really hard to understand. And the teacher or master appreciates their efforts to try and grasp the ideas being shared. A relationship with a parent is not based on ideas, ideals, comprehension, or cerebral activity at all. I'm not talking about the intrinsic relationship that we all share with our parents or with our children. I'm talking about liking the people you love. I'm talking about nurturing and developing a relationship. The things we share are not necessarily only intellectual. You may have an intellectual relationship with your children. It's a very effective way to have a relationship. That's how we Jewish people have been relating with our children from time immemorial. We study Torah together. And by sharing Torah ideas, there's no generation gap. The Zaidi loved Frank Sinatra. The parents loved Bruce Springsteen. And maybe the grandchildren loved Justin Bieber. So there's a generation gap. Very different kind of music. And maybe they can't relate to each other. The grandparents listening to one kind of music, the parents another, and the grandchildren another. But when Yidden sit together and talk of words of Torah, when you sit around the Seder table and you talk about the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, of the Exodus, and you share the teachings of our sages, the proverbial generation gap simply evaporates. In my own life as a Chassid, as an acolyte, disciple, inspired follower, I don't mean inspired as I'm inspired. I mean like being uplifted by the Rebbe. My grandparents were Chasidim. My parents are Chasidim. I try to be a Chassid. My children are Chasidim. And we share the same passion, the same fervor, the same excitement, the same enthusiasm. We talk about these kinds of things, Torah-related things, Yiddishkeit experiences. There is no generation gap. What an incredible way to live. What a beautiful way to be able to experience life together with your generations. So there's the pupil, there's the student relationship, the child relationship, Torah, tefillah, prayer, and then there's mitzvot. How are mitzvot performed? The answer is literally. If you meditate or ruminate or reflect on the meaning of the shofar but don't actually hear or listen to the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, nothing is accomplished. The essence of the mitzvah represents a bringing forth of the essence of what we will call divinity, the actualization of Hashem's will. Hashem wants us to eat matzah on the night of Pesach, to listen to the shofar on the day of Rosh Hashanah. He wants Jewish men to put on tefillin every single day. He wants all of us, men and women, to have a mezuzah that's affixed to our doorposts. He wants each of us to give of our own wealth and affluence to others. That's called tzedakah. It's the right thing to do. Hashem wants Jewish women and little girls and grandmothers to stand together and to light Shabbat candles. Ask anybody who's had the privilege of seeing 4 generations of women light Shabbat candles together. How touching it is, how special it is to see something like that. So, when we talk about mitzvahs, we talk about things performed, and the vast majority of mitzvahs are performed in the most material of ways. As the sages put it, ha'maaseh hu ha'ikar. The deed is our Jewish creed when it comes to mitzvah observance. And yet, you don't have to be a Kabbalist or a mystical-minded individual to appreciate this idea that mitzvah observance is made more meaningful when it's mindful, when it's performed out of love, out of devotion. When it doesn't only engage the hands or the feet, the mouth or the ears, but rather when it engages the totality of our person. When the mitzvah is something in which we invest ourselves emotionally and cerebrally. So Torah study always has a cerebral element to it. Invariably, if you take your studies seriously, there'll be somewhat of an emotional side to that as well. If prayer is performed properly, not as a verbal exercise, but as an emotion, emoting before Hashem, there's going to have to be Kavanah. In fact, the famous Reb Chaim Halevi of Brisk, in his precise and exact analysis of the words of the Rambam, maintains that tefillah b'loi kavanah, that prayer without any mindfulness or heartfelt intention, is worthless. It's not prayer. Reading the Shema is of value when you just say the words, because the mitzvah is to say the words. But prayer is not a verbal mitzvah. People still talk about the importance of praying with kavanah. Although on some level, mindless prayer might not be prayer altogether. When it comes to mitzvahs, however, mitzvahs have to be performed according to the specific halachic stricture. If it's an edible mitzvah, matzah for example, there is a certain amount that has to be consumed in a certain way, within a certain framework of time, at a certain time. There's halachic, legal definition of what is considered to be matzah and what is not. For example, the lechem oni, the proverbial poor man's bread that we eat on the night of Pesach, has to be more than non-leavened. If it has salt, oil, sugar, or other additives, it doesn't fulfill the mitzvah of matzah, because that's not lechem oni. It's not bread of affliction. It's bread of luxury, or flatbread. Maybe non-leavened flatbread, but still flatbread. So matzah has a definition, and it has to be eaten. Eaten means it has to be chewed. So the Mishnah talks about, what if somebody takes chunks of matzah, wraps them in lettuce, and swallows them wholesale? The matzah eventually will end up in your digestive system. Do you fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah? What if you nibble matzah? You eat the amount of matzah, an ounce of matzah, but you eat it over the course of a few hours, eating little bits at a time. What if you eat some matzah, but you don't eat an ounce, a kazayit of matzah? All of these things disqualify your fulfillment of the mitzvah, because the mitzvah has to be fulfilled in a very specific way. So suppose a Jew sits down to eat matzah on the night of Pesach, and he chomps on the cracker of matzah and swallows it. Everything according to the rigorous halachic requirements. He eats what is rigorously defined as matzah in the strictures of b'chdei achilas pras, which could be as little as 3 minutes or as much as 6 or 7 minutes. And he chews it properly, ingests it in a manner of eating. He does everything right. But in his mind, he's somewhere else. Either his mind is wandering aimlessly, he's thinking about a movie he saw, a fight he's in with somebody. Doesn't think for 1 second about God. Mitzvah, nothing doing. So, if he has no intention of even performing a mitzvah, for example, he was hungry, so he happened to sit down and happened to eat matzah on the night of Pesach, but he didn't even know he was doing a mitzvah. And he was Jewish. He only found it out a week later. Did he do the mitzvah? The Talmud's not sure. Maybe. Mitzvah tzrichas kavanah, or ein tzrichas kavanah. Do mitzvahs require mindfulness, intention, or not? And on a simple level, that means, did you have to intend to fulfill a mitzvah? The jury's out on this one, although it certainly seems that one should at least intend to fulfill a mitzvah. But if you have any experience with what we're going to call Yiddishkeit, Yahadut, the pursuit of a meaningful relationship with God, which is an essential definition of religion. It's the medium through which we have a relationship with God and the convention through which we're able to transform our world. So if you do the mitzvah passionately, with a sense of fervor, happiness, enthusiasm, sense of awe and reverence for the importance of what you're about to do, is your mitzvah more meaningful? Everybody understands the answer is yes. We strive to do mitzvot in a mindful rather than mindless way. We all understand that despite the emphasis on maaseh, on action, to invest one's mind, to engage one's emotions, so that the mitzvah becomes not only a superficial expression, but rather a tethering of one's entire persona, one's entire consciousness and self to the performance of the mitzvah, will make the mitzvah that much more meaningful. In the words of the Zohar, a mitzvah that is performed with ahava v'yira, a mitzvah that's performed with enthusiasm, with a sense of awe and respect for the greatness of what one's achieving, Baruch Hu. The mitzvah makes its way into a higher realm. And the metaphor that's employed is the wings of a bird. A mitzvah that's done mindlessly is that the body of the bird is there, and as we find in the laws of Trefot, and Alter Rebbe mentions this in Tanya, if nitla agafeh, if the wings are taken or broken, the bird is still kosher. But he also can't go anywhere. We want our mitzvahs to be uplifted, elevated. It's called maisim toivim u'meirim, a mitzvah that reflects energy and the intensity of our devotions to God. This has nothing to do with Kavanah Arizal. Kabbalah teaches us that there are many, many levels of reality. We, of course, you and I, ordinary people, are plugged into the terrestrial reality in which we exist. We define some of reality in a tangible way. If we can touch it, it's real. Otherwise, it's virtual. The difference between actually seeing something or seeing a high-definition, amazing screen, plasma screen presentation of something might not be visible to the naked eye. It could look so good that you can even fool people. Yet, they weren't really there. Couldn't touch it. Sometimes you can be somewhere but you can't see anything. You're in the dark. So you weren't really there. You didn't really see it. You were there physically, but you didn't really see it. Sometimes you're clued out. Your mind is elsewhere. Your heart is elsewhere. You're distraught. Everybody was there. Everybody experienced it. You don't even know what happened. Your body was there. You were somewhere else. These are all different forms of reality. Sometimes you see something or experience something and it triggers you to the point that you're having a very different experience than the people around you. It's almost like you weren't in the same place. These are all levels of reality of our terrestrial flesh and blood life. But that's not the only reality. That's just the reality that we're limited to. We live in a three-dimensional world. We can't even fathom reality that is beyond what we can see, feel, know, touch, or understand. But Kabbalah speaks about a heavenly realm of reality. And just as mitzvahs are performed on earth, there's an alter ego of sorts for every technical, literal reality on earth in a heavenly realm on many levels. One example of this is the way the teachings of Kabbalah will present or view biblical figures, where Moshe Rabbeinu is an actual physical person. He was born to a mother. We know her name. We know his birth date. We even know a few things about the birth. But Moshe represents more than just a baby of flesh and blood, a sack of bones and plasma. The birth of Moshe Rabbeinu also represents a spiritual revolution, a transformation in the heavens. The physical casing of Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama, the convention, the meat suit, was separated from his soul and laid to rest by God himself on Mount Nebo. But Moshe Rabbeinu's spirit continues to live. In fact, the Zohar says that tzaddikim, when they pass into the other world, they're found in all worlds, including this world, more than during the terrestrial lifetime. This is a difficult, intricate, and nuanced subject that's, again, not for our present class or this particular focus. But these are truths. Truths that we may not be capable of ever properly, fully processing or relating to. Radio waves have been around ever since when? Suppose you were to talk about radio waves a century or two ago. Who would listen? We're in the midst of reeling from a pandemic. This is not the world's first pandemic. A century ago, when the world community was dealing with the Spanish flu, as it was called then, we had some knowledge, a fair bit of knowledge about infection, and understood how to prevent that particular illness and its spread. And it took a couple of years. But in the Middle Ages, there was the Black Death or bubonic plague that claimed tens of millions of lives. One plague claimed more than 72 million lives. And people knew nothing about infection, bacteria, germs, sanitization or cleanliness. There was no way for them to be able to defend or save their lives. Were there no germs? Was there no infection? Of course there was. Viruses have always been around. The point I'm trying to make is, today we see this with crystal clarity, although once upon a time we were totally unaware of it, and then and today, the naked eye cannot see it. A person who mocks and laughs the spiritual reality because he or she can't see it sounds no less foolish than a person who mocks or laughs at infection or bacteria because he or she can't see it. And yes, bacteria can be seen if you're looking under the right set of microscope. And no, spirituality cannot be seen under a microscope because it's not a question of size or being too small for the naked eye. It's simply not in our realm. Mystical intentions, Kavanat Kabbalah, mean that the person performing the mitzvah is hyper-focused on the spiritual realities or worlds engendered by virtue of the performance of this mitzvah. The mitzvah is performed in a terrestrial world, and it brings about what's called a yichud, a unification, or the completion of a spiritual electromagnet in higher worlds, higher, higher, and yet higher. Kavanat Kabbalah were really brought into the consciousness of people in a very, very crystal clear way, if I can use that terminology, by the Arizal. Let me tell you something about the Arizal. And by means of metaphor, we'll appreciate the idea of the mystical Kavanot of the Arizal. If you've been to northern Israel, you know that there are many, many grave sites of a huge amount of righteous men and women. Who identified all these grave sites? The tombstones are not from antiquity. How do we know? How do we know where this sage from the Mishnah or that sage from the Mishnah was buried? There were decades, if not centuries, that these places were not visited by Jewish people. There may have been a local memory that some holy man or woman is buried here, but people didn't know who. The answer is the Arizal visited these sites. And he was able to identify the spirits that were present. So, for example, Maimonides instructs his body to be brought to the Holy Land of Israel and interred, but doesn't give instructions as to where. And Maimonides' coffin was placed upon a camel that plodded across the Sinai desert and walked and walked and walked until it came to the city of Tiberias. And at a certain point, it sat down and refused to get up. And those accompanying the Rambam on his final journey understood that Maimonides was to be buried here. The Arizal comes along centuries later and identifies the resting sites of the great post-Second Beit HaMikdash Mishnah sages who were buried just adjacent to the Rambam. How did the camel know? How'd the Arizal know? The camel knew because the camel was just a guided missile who had to do what it did, and it was entirely mindless and disengaged from what it was doing. It knew or understood absolutely nothing. The Arizal, visiting the gravesite of the Rambam, was able to identify the spirits of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his disciples. So the Arizal, through not only his intellectual and cerebral grasp of the intricacies of Kabbalah, but through his revelatory experiences, was able to share with us what happens when this particular mitzvah is performed. Which heavenly realms merge, unite, or come together, and again, think of an electromagnet. Think of a network. The network has to be made whole. Until it's, so to speak, plugged in, until it goes live, it doesn't work. But the moment it goes live, all of a sudden you're getting a download. Because the network is up. The codes are in. The Arizal taught us about so many different mitzvot and what their spiritual alter egos were. And then the Arizal said that if you did this mitzvah and you would think about whether it's a conjunction of Hashem's name or the particular name of an angel or the particular realm or level in what's called Siddur Ishtalshelus, the choreographed devolution of spiritual reality, then the mitzvah could be performed in a way that was not only superficial, not only would you technically satisfy the rigors of halacha, not only would you be filled with fervor and excitement, delight and awe that you could fulfill the mitzvah of Hashem, not only would it be intentful in that sense, but that you would actually be affecting higher realms of reality by the performance of your mitzvah. That's Kavanah Arizal made simple. Now in this Sefer, Likutei Oros, he writes very clearly that if you're affected by the material reality, you're not capable of transcending it, and you cannot in any way, shape, or form appreciate higher realities. And as such, your intentions will be counterfeit and therefore counterproductive. When a person takes mystical secrets about higher reality and speaks about it in gross terminology, in crass terminology, because they're living in a gross and crass world, they're actually wasting their time. And it's pointless. Because if you literalize Kabbalah, chas v'shalom, you don't have an understanding of Kabbalah, you have a caricaturization of Kabbalah. You make a mockery of higher truths. By saying that arithmetic is sweet or sour, you don't come to a better understanding of math. You simply are delusional about a mathematical equation. By attributing a particular color to a certain music, you are not defining that music. The music doesn't have a specific aroma attached to it. If you speak of music in dense, tangible fashion, have you better understood the message of the music? Or have you made the music so technical or tangible that you've actually lost its beauty and its liberating and exhilarating power? So there's a problem, an inherent issue or challenge for us to use terminology of Kabbalah and to speak about higher worlds, because we tend to frame everything with our own experiences. So we use the word sweet. Apples are sweet and honey is sweet. And our year should be sweet, literally. Sweet in a way that we can taste. You can say to a person, that's so sweet. A thought can be sweet, and music can be termed as sweet. There's obviously a corollary between sweet and sweet. Sweet ideas, sweet people, sweet food, and sweet music are all pleasing in a particular way. But if you literalize the terminology, it gets ridiculous. When I was a kid, there were books, I assume they're still around, called Amelia Bedelia. And Amelia Bedelia was this dim-witted nanny who took everything literally. So to see time fly, she threw the clock out the window. Euphemism became actual. The difference between euphemism, metaphor, parable, and actuality is not that far apart. When we literalize or actualize, if you will, draw pictures of Kabbalah reality, it's patently ridiculous. So if we think of heaven as palaces and locks, and imagine that we're putting the code in, we're going to think of the Shem Adonai and put it into Shiluv Havaya and punch the codes and imagine the door opening, and then we're in this throne room where it says there's a translucent sapphire and an onyx, and you start to imagine these things in a literal fashion. Or a garden and sweet-smelling roses, and you think of an actual rose, and this is what you picture in your mind, and you're having Kavanahs. You're having Kavanahs. Chakal tapuchin gadishin. You're going into the apple orchard, and you're actually imagining apple trees, and you're tasting apples. You're not a Kabbalist. Forgive me. You're a fool. You're studying profound truths in a ridiculous fashion. That's not called studying Kabbalah. That's called literalizing and actualizing that which cannot be literalized or actualized. It's, for lack of better terminology, lacking context and content and nuance to the nth degree. It's like equating adultery and marriage because they both deal with intimacy. It's ridiculous. It's like saying eating matzah on the night of Pesach and eating pork is both an edible activity. That's ridiculous. It would be sacrilegious to sit down and chomp on pork and make believe it's matzah. But that's kind of cerebrally what we do when we're having these kavanahs. As the Likutei Oros writes in the name of Rabbeinu Pesach, he says that kol kavanahs ha'Arizal, all of the mystical intentions of the Arizal, shebe'emes le'nemar ela la'anoshim kemoisa epochas, were meant for people like the Arizal, or at least in his ballpark. People shekvar libam toher mikol sig hamafsid, people whose hearts have been entirely cleansed and purified from the dross, from the toxins of mis'avel l'chol tanugim gashmi, of people who have lusts and cravings for sensual desire and fulfillment of gratification, for people who think of their honor. I'm offended. I'm a very spiritual person. By the way, I'm offended. It's an oxymoron. What do you mean I'm a spiritual person? Really spiritual people can't be offended. Their egos have become entirely translucent. People who are worried about their own honor or get jealous of others or angry, have sinah and kas and chemda, nikima natira. So the Likutei Oros says they're not shaykh, they're not connected to this whole business. This is only for those who are nigoshim el Hashem be'emet ve'emuna, those who come with absolute truth, with pure crystallized faith. The people for whom the material world is meaningless on a personal level. Otherwise, the Likutei Oros says it's called ziyuf. Now, of course, you can ask me the question, well, in that case, how are our mitzvahs meaningful? It's a fair question. Let me share with you a snippet of something that the Rebbe talks about in Likutei Sichos. This is in Chelik Hey, the second Sicha on Vayigash. And this is an extremely profound rumination. I'm not even doing it justice. I'm not even scratching the surface. I'm sharing with you a tiny detail of it. But this is important insofar as what we're talking about now. The Rebbe speaks about the performance of mitzvahs. And he says that mitzvahs in truth are not a means to an end. The nicht kein Mittel, was führt zu an ander Inyan. The mitzvah doesn't get you somewhere. I want to get or achieve X, Y, and Z, so I do a mitzvah, chas v'shalom. No, the tachlis is a gufa. The mitzvah itself, that is what it's all about. Varum, the rotzen of mitzvahs is an atzmus, because the desire that Hashem has, that we do a mitzvah, is rooted in the essence of divinity. Mimer, as the expression goes, kol ha-mitzvahs misyachsim ala atzmus. The mitzvahs are meaningful for no other reason than God asked us to perform the mitzvah. But he gets so atzmos. When we talk about the essence of divinity, the essence of divinity defies description. We talk about the will of God. It is impossible to speak of means to another end. The Rebbe says that this is used by the Alter Rebbe, this idea is used by the Alter Rebbe to explain in Likutei Torah Parshas Re'eh the statement which is found in Masechet Avot, Yofa sho'achas b'tshuva u'maisim tovim be'ilam hazeh mikol chayei olam haba. One moment of spiritual return, of yearning for Hashem, of a good deed, is more valuable than everything, eternity, paradise, the world to come has to offer. Chotch, despite the fact that Elam Haba is the tashlum schar of the Haveda. If you do tshuva ma'asim tevim, behave the way a person is supposed to in this world, you get rewarded. That's your remuneration. And then we say that this is greater than their remuneration. The schar muss doch l'chayre sein größer wie die avoda. The reward has to be greater than what you're doing. Otherwise, it's not a reward. And the way the Mishnah itself says, Yofa sha'achas shel kodesh ruach be'elam haba, one moment of delight, one moment, is more fulfilling, is more delightful, is more pleasurable than kol chaye ha'olam hazeh, than a lifetime filled with sensual gratification. So, how does that work? So the answer is, the tachlis hamechuvim from brias ha'adam, the ultimate or penultimate purpose of our being brought into existence, of our being created, is nitzul lib der Mensch. We are not created for ourselves. We weren't created so that we can have delight and pleasure, and that God put us through this ridiculous obstacle course so that we can have an even greater delight or pleasure if we forswear the sensual gratification of this world to taste the higher pleasures of the other world. Rather, the way the Mishnah itself says, Ani nivresi, I was created l'shamash eskoni, to serve my master. This essential task or impact is brought about through the performance of mitzvahs. The thing is this: God does not expect any of us to work for free, so to speak. He recompenses grandly. Kommt doch der Mensch, so the person, was durchgeführte Tachlis, who brought about the ultimate goal, the mission, the purpose that Hashem has, he deserves to be rewarded. The reward is a world of delight, paradise. And the paradise is to taste something of what was accomplished through a mitzvah. So with regard to the mensch, to the person, the bald is the gili from the tainig, when a person gets to taste the sweetness, the delight of the mitzvah that he was privileged to bring about. So that can only be in the other world, when there's divestiture of the material world that disallows for the appreciation of higher pleasure. And that's why we say, the pleasures of the other world are beyond our fathomability. Being in this world limits us. It doesn't allow us to experience, to know what that is. So the reward for the person who performed the mitzvah is in paradise. But then there is the object of the mitzvah itself. The mitzvah itself. That's the fulfillment of the will of Hashem. That's what we call etzem. That's called the essence of the mitzvah. So there's a revelatory part of the mitzvah and there's the essence of the mitzvah. True tzaddikim can actually have a foretaste of the mitzvah, despite the fact that they're shackled to physical, material, or tangible existence. Elam chatir b'chayecha is the expression of our sages. They actually can taste heaven on earth. So it's meaningful for them to have these experiences. And it makes sense for them to focus on what they're doing on a heavenly realm because they're actually there. There's the story of a peer of the Maggid of Mizrich who meets him, and he says, I hear that you have begun to pray for many hours. And the Maggid says, yeah, I pray for many hours. And he says, why? And he says, I pray with Kavanah Arizal. I pray with the spiritual intentions, the meditations of the Arizal. So this man was a very great scholar. He says, I also pray with Kavanah Arizal, but it doesn't take many hours. To which the Maggid said, what do you do for a living? Seeming to change the subject. And the man says, well, I go to the big market periodically, and I purchase all kinds of dry goods, and then I come home, and my wife is kind enough to run this dry goods store, and I devote myself to spiritual service and prayer. And this is, well, many people like this in Europe who did that. They had a partnership. He would do the travels. He would go to the proverbial market, literal market. He would get the merchandise, bring it home, and then his wife stepped in and ran the dry goods store while he was able to devote himself to spiritual pursuit. So the Maggid says to him, how much time does it take for you to travel to the name of the places, Leipzig, to go to this big market? He said, it's travel. There's a week's travel, and then there's a week of finding the merchandise, purchasing the merchandise, packing the merchandise, and then there's the travel home. So it's 3 weeks. And then he can study Torah for a month or two, and then however much time elapses, it's time to go back to the source. So you bought the goods for a wholesale price, you sold them for a retail, there's a tidy profit, your principal is back, and then rinse and repeat. So the Maggid says to him, I don't understand. Why do you have to spend a full week traveling? And he's listing the name of the cities that he passes along the road. And then spend a week going through the marketplace, visiting the different stalls and purchasing the merchandise. And then spend a week traveling back. The Maggid said, I just repeated the names of all the places you were in. I just repeated the words describing all of the merchandise. And I described the journey back. It didn't take 3 weeks, it took 5 minutes. To which this man incredulously said to his erstwhile peer, who had flown far away from his level. He said to the Maggid, Rebbeinu, he said, of what value will it be for me to speak about the journey or speak about the merchandise? You have to have the merchandise. Indeed, said the Maggid, of what value is it to speak about Kavanah or think about Kavanah or Arizal? What does this mean? To be fully transparent? I don't know. I'm not a tzaddik. I'm a small little person, like most of you. A person who worries about himself and thinks about things in a selfish fashion. A person for whom self-gratification and libido is part of my reality. A person who gets offended when people abuse him and mistreat him. Yes, I get angry like anybody else does. Sure, we struggle against it and work with it, but that's who we are. We're stuck, we're trapped in our very small, pygmy reality. But real tzaddikim, they experience things in a different way. There's a beautiful story told about the Maggid's first meeting with the Baal Shem Tov. I'm not going to go through the whole introduction of the story, but to make it brief, when the Maggid finally does meet the Baal Shem Tov asks him, do you study the writings, Lurianic writings? And the Maggid responds affirmatively. And the Baal Shem Tov says, then tell me pshat. And he hands him a volume of the writings of Reb Chaim Vital, the Pre-Eitz Chaim. And so he looks at the Pre-Eitz Chaim and he tells the Maggid. The Maggid tells the Baal Shem Tov the pshat. And as the story goes, the Maggid hands the sefer back to the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov looks contemplatively back and he says, no, tell me pshat. And he hands him again the sefer. And once again the Maggid looks again, and the Maggid was a tremendous Torah genius, and he says, I beg to differ. That is the pshat. That's the meaning. If the Baal Shem Tov has a different pshat, let him tell me. And the Baal Shem Tov took the book of Pre-Eitz Chaim and he began to teach and speak about the Lurianic Kabbalah, and all of a sudden the realities that he was speaking about became apparent to the Maggid. He experienced rather than spoke of. Imagine a person who speaks about a delicious meal. He describes the menu in great detail. He can talk about the steps taken to prepare this culinary delight. He didn't find a moment of satiation. He didn't get to taste. He doesn't have any satisfaction from it, because he's just talking about the food. That's kind of what this is like, and I don't know what I'm talking about because I never experienced this. I'm not a tzaddik. By the way, that's okay. Hashem has pleasure from our avodah, from who we are. So why are we talking about Kavanahs then? So it seems that there are multiple Kavanahs of the Baal Shem Tov. Later on in this very same Siddur, on page 460, the Rebbe writes, and this is from the manuscript of the Rebbe, Kavanahs HaTekiyot me Baal Shem Tov. And he writes in the Sefer Shmua Teva, which is printed in Warsaw in 1938, there is a printed version, a listing, of Kavanahs of the Baal Shem Tov. And before it says that this was copied from an old manuscript which is found in the personal collection of the famed Torah luminary and very righteous Maggid of Koznitz. And some of these manuscripts are found in the personal collection of the luminary, the tzaddik, the leader of the Chasidim called Ger, known as the Sfas Emes. The Rebbe writes, it's pretty clear to me that these are the Kavanahs of the Arizal, as they are found in the Siddur of Reb Shabsi of Rashkov, a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov. Ulecha'ira, the Rebbe says, there is no connection between the explanation of the Alter Rebbe in the Mimer that we're talking about and the Kavanahs that are mentioned here. And so the Rebbe says something fascinating. Al Korchach, therefore, tzarech loimu, we must say, sheyeshtem oid Kavanahs la Baal Shem Tov, that there are other Kavanahs of the Baal Shem Tov which are shoynes me Kavanahs ha'Arizal, different from the Kavanah of the Arizal. However, the Rebbe says, in order to present something complete, and since I don't have another manuscript to share, I am going to print the manuscript as it is here, and it's 4 pages long. And it reads like a chemistry book. Various Kabbalistic jargon, different formulas, which to the vast, overwhelming majority of people make no sense whatsoever. It reads like total gibberish. And even if you can make some sense out of it, you're just reading about something. That's not what the Kavanahs of the Baal Shem Tov were intended for. So Kavanahs HaMikvah Baal Shem Tov is actually articulated. There's the Kavanah of mikvah, immersion in the mikvah of the Arizal, and then the different Kavanah of the Baal Shem Tov. The bottom line is that there seems to be Kavanahs of the Baal Shem Tov that are encoded into this Mimer. And it's not the Kavanahs that are beyond us. This is a Kavanah that we are capable of reaching. Perhaps this is what's alluded to in a letter of the Frierdiker Rebbe. This is printed in Yiddishkeit of the Frierdiker Rebbe in the 3rd volume. And it's part of a long collection of letters that was written by the previous Rebbe in the year 1896, in the summer of 1896. And he writes over there that the way we can rectify the many mistakes and the misdemeanors, the slip-ups of the year that has gone by, is durch tshuva, is with a sense of profound return to Hashem. And the time of tshuva, wrote the Frierdiker Rebbe, is b'shas Tkiyah Shofar. And then he writes, and I quote, the Baal Shem Tov sagt am Moshel of Tkiyah Shofar. The Baal Shem Tov offers a parable to give us insight for the shofar blast, shofar blowing. A Melech hat geschickt seine Kinder in a große Wald fangen Chayas. A king sent his progeny, his children, into a mission. You know, this is like kind of thing that was done in antiquity to capture animals, sent into the jungle to bring home wild animals. The Kinder haben verblunget. The children got lost in the jungle. They began to call out to the father, and they didn't get an answer. I guess the father was within earshot. Haben sie getracht, they thought to themselves, Efsher haben sie vergessen sie eigene Sprache. Maybe from the trauma and the terrors of the jungle, they forgot their literacy and they couldn't speak, couldn't articulate themselves. Haben sie genommen schreien von tiefen Herzen, they began to cry out from the depths of the heart zum Vater, ai, ai! Just a sound, a guttural sound of yearning, of pain, of concern, unwerte, with no words. Nur die Stimme allein, just the voice alone. Hat sie der Vater gehört. And in this way the Father heard them. So there's something guttural, something intrinsic about the sound of the shofar that we're supposed to be able to relate to. In a Mimer, a manuscript, a Chasidic manuscript of the previous Rebbe, which is printed in the Maimorim of Rosh Hashanah of 1943, the Friedrich Rebbe writes that HaTekiyot Shofar al pi Kavanah Baal Shem Tov neshmas Eden hu hamshachas hatainug b'dibur ha'elyon, is the bringing forth of divine delight or pleasure in the higher form of speech, of Eser Marmoris, of the 10 utterances that are proverbially found in the Sphira, in the Kabbalistic level which is known as Malchut. And it happens, it's performed al yedei hatzaika, by the crying out, Abba, Abba, Father, Father. The imheyes, the Inyan, koil ha-shofar ukel poshut, despite the fact that the sound of the shofar is inarticulate. It's unsophisticated. It's primal. There is some form of articulation attached to it. Like the beginning of the word Abba, which starts with an Aleph. And even though unsophisticated, unlettered audibility cannot be equaled to articulate speech, and they're very far from one another, nonetheless, that primal cry that comes from the essence or the depths of the heart, like a shofar blast, that hasn't yet been articulated or developed, has a certain power because of where it comes from. The Friedrich Rebbe talks about this in the opening Mimer of Rosh Hashanah of 1944. Before we sound the shofar, we recite or chant the verse, Min ha-meitzar karasa yudke, I cry to you from the depths of sorrow, from the depths of pain and anguish. And the Friedrich Rebbe says that this pasuk, which is recited before the sounding of the shofar, according to the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, Nishmas Eden, is that there's a hisoidus pnimius, that there's an inner awakening, that there's a cry, that the shofar represents, that you're crying out, Abba, Abba. And that it's not simply a cry of pain, although it is brought forth because of the suffering and the anguish. But rather, it becomes a cry of yearning, a cry of great desire to be reunited with our merciful Father. And although it is caused by pain, although it is caused by a negative situation, it ultimately becomes a pure and sincere expression, a heartfelt expression, from which comes the merchav, the broad and spacious deliverance of Yudke. In other words, there seems to be another kavanah of the Baal Shem Tov. And in closing, what we're perhaps seeking to accomplish here in the study of this Mimer, is not the technical kavanah of the Arizal, which looks similar to the kavanah of Baal Shem Tov, and perhaps we'll talk more about that at a later point. But there's this overarching kind of message that is a code of sorts, an intention, a meditation, which we are capable of achieving. And it is Kavanah Baal Shem Tov. And it's within reach, in a meaningful way. And that's what we're going to try to explore and discover, Be'ezrat Hashem, as we continue to move through our new series, Shofar FX, the special effects, the secret power of the sound of the shofar. I hope that you've enjoyed what we learned today and found it somewhat informative, uplifting, inspirational. I hope that you'll continue to join me, because nobody can have these kavanahs for us if we make the effort and put the time in. Our Rosh Hashanah will be far more exhilarating, far more impactful as a result of the time invested prior to it. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should help us that the study of these mystical and spiritual ideas should indeed enable us to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu be'emes. And along with that should come the bracha and atzlacha, the blessing and the success for a new year that is filled with aura, with light, with bracha, with blessings from Hashem, and with geula, with redemption, through Mashiach and the sounding of the great Shofar. Thanks for joining today. If you like this, please take a moment to hit like. Share it with friends or family. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so at youtube.com/Rabbi Mendel Kaplan. Thank you again for joining. Have a beautiful day.